Okay, so I think I'm gonna give it a start to the webinar. Um, so, well, first of all, I'd like to say hi everyone and welcome to another Applying Ethology webinar series hosted by the Animal Welfare Slack Workplace. So my name, for those of you that don't know me, is Laura Salazar. And on behalf of Christian Navroth, Sebastian Gumon, and Yen Yun Cho, we would like to thank you for joining us today. So before we start, it'd be great if everyone could help me double check your mic is muted and your camera is turned off. As I can see, that's correct. Also, if you had any questions or comments during or after the talk, please type them in the chat box and we can go through them at the end of the talk. Or you can also just raise your virtual hand and at the end of the talk and we will call your name. So today we are happy to have Dr. Rebekah Humphreys, who will be presenting her talk, which is titled Shared Language, Meaningful Communication, and Interspecies Trust, a discussion of animal language through the work of Vicky Hearn. I hope I'm not butchering the name. So Dr. Rebekah Humphreys is a senior lecturer in philosophy at the University of Wales Trinity St. Davis. Her research is in applied ethics and overlaps with ethology and psychology. She has a particular focus on animal and environmental ethics and is especially interested in interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary approaches that can drive progress in addressing key issues related to justice, climate ethics, the environment, hunger, and health. So Rebekah also serves as co-chair of the University Research Ethics and Integrity Committee and is actively involved in editorial work for academic journals. In addition, she contributes as an external examiner, participates extensively in committee works, and provides consultative and advisory support. So, with no further ado, I would like to hand the floor over to you, Rebekah. So, if you like, you can put your slides into presentation mode,
Thank
and
you.
we are here and I leave you the floor for you.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much, Laura. So thank you everyone for coming today. So I thought today what I'd like to discuss are some issues to do with animal language arising from the work of Vicky Hearn. I've been very interested in the work of Vicky Hearn for many years now. She's quite controversial because she is an animal trainer. And of course, some people find training animals controversial in any case, but she has a particular method of animal training. But I think her work is very interesting, and I think her approach to animal language and communication and the trust that can be found between humans and other animals can tell us a lot about how we can live flourishing lives alongside other animals, other than humans, of course. So, what I'd like to do for this talk is draw together some key themes that I think come from her work, which surround the topic of anthropomorphism, including issues to do with meaningful communication, skepticism regarding animal consciousness, trust between different species or different animals, I should say, and the importance of the role of the body in relation to animal languages. So I'm going to discuss problems of consciousness to a certain extent, or they'll be in the background. And I'm going to reinterpret those problems as problems of something quite a different nature to problems of consciousness. I'm going to reinterpret them in some ways problems concerning language and how we describe animal mentality. Um, so anthropomorphism, to a certain extent, still remains somewhat taboo, I think, at least in the philosophical and scientific arena. And the problem today isn't so much, skepticism regarding animal minds or animal mentality. I mean, most people would agree that at least mammals and vertebrates, other vertebrates are conscious, or maybe that's too big a claim, but I think a lot of people hear word, or most of us hear word. But I think instead there appears to be more of a problem concerning how we describe animal states, how we describe the consciousness of animals, and and disagreement with regards to the concepts that we can justifiably apply to animals. So there's a kind of disagreement about what we can say about the mental states of animals. And while most people wouldn't deny that animals can feel distress or animals can feel discomfort or animals can suffer and feel pain, there's still a sort of skepticism around how we talk about animal emotions, how we talk about positive and negative states in relation to animal mentality. So, on the one hand, the way in which we sometimes talk about animals in the literature in terms of responses to stimuli, a way of trying to be objective, this gives an inaccurate portrayal of animals. And on the other hand, I think philosophers and scientists are sometimes skeptical of using words like intends or knows or believes in relation to animal behavior. So we reach a kind of difficult position because then we can ask ourselves, how are we supposed to talk about animals without using language that's either reductivistic or without being accused, sorry, of equating human-like thoughts with animal-like ones. One suggestion here that I'll briefly mention might be found in post-humanism because it calls for moving beyond the anthropomorphic way of speaking about animals. But this tends to replace one problematic term, or supposedly problematic term, which relates to anthropomorphism, with another problematic term, which is posthumanism, because posthumanism itself raises lots of problems, I think. But we can discuss that during the question time if there are any questions about that. So what I'd like to do is think about, how we talk about animals, how we talk about the ways in which they communicate, because I think human language is still generally considered to be unique because, of course, it alone uses words and speech to express thoughts. So, in that sense, it's seen as the exemplar of what it means to have a language. And this is something that Hearn very much challenges. This, what she would say is a human exceptionalist view of human. And the quotes. Just if you're not familiar with her work, just to give you a flavour of the sorts of things she says in relation to interspecies communication. Going back to that paradigmatic sort of human exceptionalist view of language as the spoken and written word, to compare animal to compare non-human animal languages or animal communication more generally with human language in this sort of Cartesian sense. I think just to start, that misses some important observations. And Raymond Gator is quite helpful here because he mentions that sounds can function just as effectively in a system of communication as words can function. And he says this, okay, so he says arguments about whether signing chimps are really using language will not be settled by observation because what counts as language can't be settled that way. We know cows communicate to each other when they moo, and nobody thinks they are speaking or that moo is another word in a cow language. What it is for something to be a word has proved to be a difficult question, and there is great controversy around it, not only in philosophy but in the natural sciences, where there has been a long argument over whether chimps who have learnt to sign have learnt language. Now, there may be some people in this online room who think that cows, in particular, moo in particular ways, and that those moos can function just as meaningfully as can a word. And I don't want to dispute that or argue against or for that. But there is a distinction, I think, to be made between sounds that function purely as communicative tools and those that have meaning. So those that have meaning can function as communicative tools, but in addition, they mean something to the beings transmitting the sounds and to the receivers of those sounds. So in this sense, sounds other than words, other than conversations, utterances, other forms of human speech, could have as much meaning as words themselves. And this is something that Hearn certainly thinks is true, at least of certain animals. So, alongside sort of sound modes of communication, the spoken word, but also things like echolocation, bodily expressions can sometimes serve as the same purposes. So, as with sound communications, they may function as a communicative tool alone, but they also may function in a system of communication that has meaning to the creatures emitting the sounds and to the beings receiving the sounds. And in certain contexts, expressions, bodily expressions, can have, I believe, as much meaning as we give a word. And and this is where Hearn's reflections on language are illuminating here, because for Hearn, all communications that need to be called language, and it's her way of talking about language is quite controversial because it goes against the idea that language has some kind of universal element to it, which is embodied in human beings. But for Hearn, all communications that can be called language need to have syntax or they need to have grammar. And they need to follow the rules of language, but they need not be restricted to human communications. So she says, calling anything in the exchanges between horses and humans syntactical as well as semantical is problematic, I know. But I've come to think of syntax as prior to semantics, or of semantics as requiring syntax, since even a gesture or utterance, such as stop, is meaningful only in the context of what comes before and after, and there are rules around what comes before and after. There are vast conceptual differences between what people can do with language and what chimps and gorillas can do, but worrying about preserving the word syntax for use in discussions of human sentences will never enable us to understand them. So Hearn sees many animal behaviors as following syntactical and grammatical rules. So just as words are placed within a structure to form sentences, and then sentences are placed within a wider narrative to give meaning. So, in terms of the written word or the spoken word, so too do animal behaviors take place within this structure and then within this larger narrative context. And it's this kind of structure that gives behaviors meaning. So she says, even in the case of what appears to be a gesture or signal consisting of a single counter, as when Belle barks to let out, the bark or door scratching is meaningless without what goes before and after in certain ways. If she scratches at the door, then settles to a food dish which is near the door, the scratching is neither syntactical nor semantic, and relationships require syntax. So for her, it's impossible for behaviors, words, sentences to be meaningful without grammar or syntax and without this larger narrative framework. And she also perceives the scent work of dogs as involving meaningful communication and even advanced syntax. So she says of her dog Salty, when sent to select one or more, articles, one or more items by scent, she can say to a dog, it's this one rather than that one. She can say, go and fetch this particular item rather than that particular item. And this kind of scent work, in a sense, enables a shared language between humans and dogs. It's a prime example, I suppose, a good example of where that shared language exists. Not all dogs are capable of this kind of complex communication or have been trained in this way, but it's very interesting, I think, that she applies the way in which we think about syntax to retrieving and to scent work. And in fact, with retrieval, the complex syntax that she sees as involved in that comes through, and she thinks it involves deeper modes of understanding. So she says, and the quote here on the slide, now there are all sorts of ways our language can be projected. I have her retrieve things besides her dumbbell. Perhaps I have her retrieve Uncle Albert. Retrieving can become carrying messages. I can teach a directive retrieve, having her things I having her retrieve things I cannot having her retrieve things I haven't thrown. I can, that is, use fetch to name things. And this is very interesting, I think, because naming is an advanced activity of language. Putting a name on things is to have knowledge of those things and to communicate meaningfully about those things to someone other than ourselves. And Hearn here is not trying to say that dogs need to learn, English language to communicate meaningfully, of course, because as we've seen, for Hearn, she thinks that bodily behaviors can be syntactical and grammatical. And for her, that's what gives meaning to our behaviors and allows us to say that a creature has language. It's a very Wittgensteinian, well, Kern is a Wittgensteinian. But for Hearn, communication, this kind of communication doesn't just take place in a narrative context. That narrative context has to also be embedded in time. So communications then, meaningful communications for her can only take place within creatures, well, between creatures who are able to link past and present. All knowledge for her requires meaning in time and requires syntax. So this is another quite interesting element of her work, I think. So she says, the second quote on the handout, horses have their own grammar of time. They can't say anything that requires past, present, or future tense, but that doesn't mean that without us they live in eternity, in the present tense only. Their concept of time might be expressed by saying that the names of their tenses are not yet, here, and gone. You can't make appointments with such tenses, but you can remember and you can anticipate the future with no little anxiety. So, Hearn's discussions here, they're focused on the life worlds of humans and horses and dogs, but they reaffirm that animals are sentient animals are conscious of the world in their own species-specific way. They need not able to understand tenses, words, letters, sentences, or numbers, or even symbols in order to communicate meaningfully. Not in the strict sense that humans understand symbols. There are different ways in which grammar can be in which bodily behaviors can be grammatical and syntactical. Uh, they may be different from the spoken and written word, but there are structures that surround complex animals' behaviors which allow us to communicate meaningfully with other animals, and of course allows other animals to communicate meaningfully with other species. So Hearn, at the time when Hearn was writing, this was wildly controversial because she boldly redefined language. And she says, if we consider the quote on the handout now, on the slide, sorry, if we consider the size and kind of the social space created by language, and if we describe the integrity of a language as the physical, intellectual, and spiritual distance talking enables a speaker to travel, then it looks as though the dog and the horse, whose linguistic codes appear simpler and have a greater command, sorry, whose linguistic codes appear simpler, have a greater command of language than chimpanzees. The dog trainer language is more primitive, but I can go a lot farther with my dog than I can with a Nazi. This might seem a very strange, odd thing to say, but I'll tell you what I think she's saying in a moment. I don't know exactly, but I'll return to that in a moment. But this redefinition of language suggests that there are different ways of speaking, and that animals can take part in these ways in their own species specific way. But also that there are interspecies overlaps of communicative abilities makes evolutionary sense, of course. And one thing I want to just flag up here is that language, as it's used by humans, is a particular way of representing the world, of course. But there's a sense in which we should maybe consider that the way in which we represent the world can restrict our understanding. Well, it does, it restricts our understanding in a particular way. And it could even prevent us from evaluating well, not evaluating, but it could even prevent us from gaining an awareness of other ways of meaningfully interacting with the world. It could prevent a serious appraisal of those other ways to the extent that, and this is something that the ethologist Marta Kiley Worthington talks about quite a lot. She says that it human language can even create its own worlds, so that eventually language users believe that this is the only way to communicate for cognitively able beings. And I think that's something worth thinking about. And I think that's something that Hearn rightly challenges at a time when it was very controversial to challenge. So language, what I'm suggesting here is our own way of our own human language does put restrictions, or can and does put restrictions on what we can know. But I think with the reflections here through, thinking about what thinking about what Hearn says in her work, um, it makes, if Hearn's right, then anthropomorphic language is appropriate to describe animals' life worlds. But there is still a fear, I think, about using particular forms of anthropomorphism. And sometimes this fear, I think, has blown all talk of animals out of proportion to what animals are really like. and how animals really act. And sometimes to the point where maybe we've been afraid to say what we really think about animals or what we really see in animal behavior. But Hearn effectively, I think, articulates a life world with animals that isn't sentimental. She overcomes the sort of self-indulgent sentimentalism, but she doesn't approach talking about animals through a reductivistic, mechanistic approach. And this approach tends to just reduce animals to objects rather than sentient creatures. So I think she strikes a good balance in talking about animals using anthropomorphic language without going down the sentimentalist route and without going down the purely reductivistic mechanomorphic route, we should say, where animals are thought about purely as in terms of responses to stimuli and so forth. And for Hearn, this type of mechanical the mechanico-morphist approach to describing animals' life world denies animals consciousness. It denies them sentience. And similarly, not similarly, but by parity, the sentimentalist approach denies animals what they really are in terms of their own species-specific capacities. But because the sentimentalist approach, Hume would say, perceives animals not as subjects in their own right, but as objects for our own self-indulgence, for our own needs and feelings. And for Hearn, these types of life worlds, these ways of talking about animals are just as inadequate as, say, the life world of a Nazi. And I take it that this is akin to what Hearn means when she says here, this strange sentence, I can go a lot farther with my dog than I can with a Nazi. And Hearn's definition of language, I think, is incredibly interesting because it's often believed that those animals that can most communicate meaningfully, other than humans, are the apes, because of previous ape language studies and so on. But there is a sense, I want to say here, that we can communicate much more meaningfully with companion animals than with non-companion ones or free-living ones. And although animals like chimps may be closer to us in evolutionary terms, perhaps we're looking too far away from home to discover the language skills of animals, or perhaps we have in the past. And what's, I think, important here is that between Hearn and her companion, well, more than companions, they're also working animals. There's a sense of trust between the humans and the animals, the other animals. And the animals that she works with have come to know the society of which they're a part of. And of course, the society we have is one that we share with other animals. So dogs, for example, will learn what's expected of them. And this sense, the relationship between a dog and her human caregiver becomes one of trust, one of responsibility on the part of both the dog and the human. I mean, that's not to say that dogs have the same sense of trust and responsibility as we do, or that they can be held morally responsible. But the relationship, I mean, can be a trusting, responsible one without the need for the animal to reflect on trust or responsibility. So dogs and other companion animals can come to know what's expected of them qua dogs in similar ways that humans can come to know what's expected of them qua humans. And this way of fitting into the rules of society creates a trusting, I think, and responsible relationship between a human and her companion animal, and I'm including here farm animals. Um, and in this sense, because language sort of, to a certain degree, requires an awareness of fitting in with the rules of society and the rules of the game, so to speak, in a Wittgensteinian sense. If we think about languages involving this as a shared space between humans and other animals that can be in which a relationship between humans and animals can be deepened and a responsible relationship through trust, through knowing the intimate behaviors and details of the creatures concerned. In that sense, if we think about language in that way, then companion animals do have, or could be seen as having a greater command of language than some wild animals, at least within certain contexts. Okay, and I think, I mean, one of the interesting things, I'll wrap up now, but when we think about the ape language studies of the past and all the problems with these with these studies, we see that, and this goes with training in inverted commas, certain other animals or wild animals or free living animals. Um, it's the non-human animals that suffer the most from these particular relationships with humans. And many of the apes that were in these studies spent the rest of their lives. I know there were a big rescue effort, but for some time they spent their lives in cages, zoos, or sanctuaries. Um, because once they sexually mature, of course, they become very difficult to handle, if that makes sense. I don't like that expression. Um, but with no trust in the relationship, it's not possible for the apes to live in a home with the humans and have a well-adjusted life for the apes or the humans. But there are animals which this doesn't apply to. And one of the things that Hearn says, and I think is quite interesting, is that, it's not necessary to, she says, pension off the family dog for the sake of the marriage. There are some animals that fit our lives and that we have a way of communicating with them for the very reason that they're domesticated to a certain extent. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but we can develop intimate ways of speaking with them. And so perhaps, these kinds of reflections apply not just to dogs and horses, but to all companion animals, rabbits, chickens, cows, farm animals, those animals that we have a close relationship with. And these are the animals that, despite supposed linguistic limitations, and despite physical, mental differences to ourselves, you know, these are the animals that I think have been very much neglected in philosophy of animal communication. So the idea that horses, rabbits, dogs, cats, domesticated animals, farm animals included, may have a greater command of language than some of those animals that more evolutionary closer to us is an idea that I think has been quite neglected and deserves more attention, deserves to be taken seriously, and it is currently. Um, so I think these are the animals that we most interact closely with, and of course, these are also some of the most oppressed animals on the planet. So is a lot at stake. So just to finish then, a nuanced and accurate understanding of the way in which animals communicate and what we might be prepared to say is animal language or meaningful communication between humans and other animals. This sort of nuanced understanding of animals, I think, can be obtained on the back of trusting relationships. And trust, I think, results in certain social worlds, certain shared language games being revealed to us, and the life worlds of particular animals being revealed. And where those life worlds overlap or can coherently overlap with our own. So this all suggests that we reevaluate our ways of thinking about animals. We reevaluate supposed anthropomorphic descriptions of animals' lives. If animals can take part in our language and we can take part to a certain extent in theirs, if there is that overlap, then anthropomorphic language is not always unjustified. And in this sense, anthropomorphic language is not merely metaphorical, it has or can have, I'm suggesting, an ontological basis indicating sort of real attributes from which language and communication arises. So I think I better stop there. I tried to cover too much, I think, in the time that I had. So I've run over a bit. I'm sorry. So I'll just stop sharing now. And just,
Hey,
yeah, hi, Laura.
Rebecca, well, that was super interesting. Thank you for bringing that up to us. Um, Really nice presentation as well. I love the slides. Um, yes. So just to remember to the audience, to remind the audience that you can all post your questions in the chat box and we will read them just now. And also, if you prefer, you can also obviously raise your hand and we will call your name if you had any questions. If you are anything like me, animal scientist with not much experience with philosophical topics, philosophical background, please don't don't be fearful and make your questions because I think Rebecca she has lots to say and about the topic and it's very interesting as well. So while we give the audience a few minutes to think about questions and type them into the chat, I would like to ask you my own question, a humble question. As you said, I mean, what I understood is that the communication in non-human animals seems to be contextual, and that it has rules of how the message is should be delivered, so it has a meaning. It is also, I also understand that it is flexible as it changes depending on the context or who they're interacting with. So I agree that it's true that bare observation might not be enough to uncover the communication and language in non-human animals. So about this, I was wondering what other means can be used to study animals' language in their natural habitat. And so I have a few questions. So is that, and also I wonder how how the closer or not so closer relationship with some species um, may affect our understanding of whether they have a language, and also what would be the implications in terms of animal ethics. Um, so there were
Yeah.
a few
Okay.
questions there, but
Oh,
you can pick
yeah.
and choose what you answer.
Sorry, there was just a slide. At some point, I think I forgot to go through my slides, but I can't see very well where I am because the sun is shining in. I'm sitting in a conservatory and the sun is shining, but I wanted to show
Oh,
you.
lovely.
Yeah, yeah, nice, but very hot. I wanted to show you a picture of my rescued rabbit, so perhaps I'll do that in a moment. So I think the first question was how we can study animals more in their natural habitat. I think,
Yeah.
and I'm
Mhm.
sure people here would agree. I mean, maybe they wouldn't as scientists, but um, that we if possible, study animals in their natural habitat. I know that's not always possible, um, or
Hmm.
at least the semi-natural habitat. And if we are going to study them in laboratories, try to make their habitat as natural as possible. I think studying them in their natural habitat does take time and does take patience and can be very arduous and, as I said, time consuming, and requires quite close observation to gain a sort of trusting relationship over time, so as the animal's behavior not to be thereby affected by our presence. And that's quite a difficult thing to do, I think, takes time and resources. Um,
Hmm.
what were the other two questions? Sorry, Laura.
Oh, no worries. There were, I think it was a bit too long.
Sorry, I
So,
didn't hear the other two questions, but when you said them, I was trying to find I was trying to find my rabbit slides.
yeah, that's fine. So I was also wondering how, so I understand, so we have different relationship to different species, right? So
Yeah.
the relationships that we build with some species might be closer than others. So I'm thinking dogs, for instance, our relationship with them is quite close. So we have our evolution has been, how you say it has been co-evolution, right? As opposed to other species where our understanding or our relationship with them is not so close.
Yeah.
So I was wondering how that closeness can affect the how we can understand the language that they have.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, I think with regards to dogs, I mean it's dogs are a prime example, aren't they, of that close relationship that we have with other animals other than humans. And some people have closer relationships with their dogs than they do with other humans. And I'm sure if there are people in this talk that have dogs, they may think that they know their dogs better than they do some other members of their family, I'm sure. Um, I think I wouldn't want to say that because an animal is free living that it doesn't have the same capacities for meaningful communication as domesticated animals, or that we can't have that particular um, interspecies communication with free living animals. But the way in which an animal communicates with members of its species and members with other species largely depends on not just, of course, its own species-specific capacities and its individual traits, but also on its learning environment, the way in which it's been brought up, the way in which it is learned to deal with its environment. And there are examples, of course, of deer and other wild animals living living lives with humans in which there is a shared overlap of language or overlap of communication, such that the communication is meaningful and that the two species can live together, the humans and the deer or whatever else it may be. But often these examples of particular wild animals or free living animals that have particular learning experiences. So the deer, for example, that has learned to take the food from humans because deer food is scarce in the area. The robin that has learned to eat out of a particular human's hand, because this particular human has taken the time to encourage and to show that this she can be trusted. These are quite exceptional examples. I mean, a good example, I suppose, of an exceptional, uh, other than the norm relation between a wild animal and a human might be from Mark Rowlands's work. Philosophers here will be aware of Mark Rowlands's work. So, Mark Rowlands rescued once a wolf, and the wolf was called Brenin. And I think I have a quote on the handout on the PowerPoint, which I could show you. But um, the way in which Brennan ended up living, because it couldn't be rehabilitated, it couldn't be rehabilitated and released back into the wild. Brennan and Roland ended up communicating in such a way that a shared language did exist, and this allowed Brennan, the wolf, to allow to live a relatively flourishing life. Obviously, the it was a life which was very different from the life it would have lived in the wild. But these cases of between humans and wild wolves are very, very exceptional, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things that interests me about Hearn's work is it encourages us to look more closer around us to the animals we already interact with on a daily basis. The animals some of which well, many of whom we exploit and use for our own benefits, and look at the ways in which they communicate when allowed to flourish after their own kind, when allowed to exercise their capacities in particular ways relative to what's good for their own good to themselves as individuals and their species, then we see the full extent of that animal's capacities, and we see the full extent then to which we can share in its ways of communicating, and they can share in ours as well. So I think that encouragement to look closer to home is is important, I think,
Mm-hmm.
because these are the animals that we interact with most closely. These are the animals that we use, abuse, and so on and so forth. And there are ideological reasons, I think, around why perhaps research hasn't gone in the changing significantly now, I think, particularly
Mm-hmm.
this cost action and the cost effect Evo action that some of you will be aware of. And I think there are more researchers interested in animal language, and it's becoming less taboo to talk of animal language. Eva Major is a prime example of a philosopher who isn't afraid to talk in terms of new ways of working with animals, listening to animals and listening to what they're saying. Of course, animals aren't always trying to tell us something. They're not always talking to us, but I think just being more aware of those overlaps between humans and animals can tell us so much about the cognitive abilities of animals as well, and the conscious experiences animals are in fact capable of. So rather than looking at conscious states and the problem of consciousness and what animals are capable of cognitively, and then thinking about whether they can communicate meaningfully with humans or use language. And this is suggesting that we do it the other way round, I suppose. We think about how they're communicating meaningfully, and then we think about what that indicates about their cognitive abilities.
Mm. Well, that's so interesting. Um, I'm wondering how, from what, sorry, I'm trying
Okay.
to find my head around all of this. Um, so I was thinking, is there an influence when we want to study the language of the animals, animal language? Is there an influence of how much we understand as particular species, or
Mm.
do you think it's possible to equally study all different species? Um,
It's
is
probably
that
not. Yeah, it's a really good
is
question.
that clear
Yeah,
enough what
I
I'm
kind of
asking,
know
or?
yeah, I know what you mean.
Mm,
It probably isn't. I mean, I'm not really sure, but I would say, I mean, I believe that sort of trans knowledge is important. So knowledge of from the people who live and work alongside animals. I think as philosophers and scientists, we tend to look or try to strive for certain sort of objectivity when we're
Mm.
observing animals. But I think that can create its own biases and the way in which rabbits are a prime example of this. In my midlife crisis involved getting rescuing rabbits and looking at the ways in which they binky and all the sorts of things that they can do, and it really opened up my mind to what rabbits were actually capable of, because
Mm.
the way in which I perceived rabbits as a child was kept in a hutch, and obviously kept in a hutch there's only certain ways in which it can behave. It can't reveal all that it's capable of. And so I think we can get in the way sometimes of our own attempt to gain knowledge by putting animals in particular positions and then just observing them in that
Mm.
particular context, rather than giving them the space to flourish and then seeing what they're capable of. That isn't always
Exactly.
possible, of
Mm.
course, particularly not with animals where who are hard to access. Underwater animals being a prime example of this,
Mm.
or animals which are solitary and hard to sort of view in the wild. So
Mm.
with companion animals, we do, these animals aren't hard to access.
Mhm.
We live everyday lives with these animals, and I'd really love to see more research in the area of, you know, animal languages more generally, because I think when we think about the climate crisis, for example, and the broader context, then we're going to need new ways of living in an interspecies way. And we're going to have to be quite innovative. We're going to have to think about ways of living respectfully with species that we might not have lived so closely with before, whether it's just the birds in our garden or whether it's animals in the forest or whatever it is. We're going to have to think about different ways of working, living alongside animals. And I think companion animals could tell us a lot about that, what we're already doing right. But I
Mhm.
think I'm digressing slightly, Laura, quite a bit actually. But but
Sorry, could you repeat that last thing that
I
you
said
said?
I'm digressing quite a bit. Sorry, Laura. I'm digressing quite a bit, but I think it's a really good question. Maybe there are some animals we can't do it with, but we get a lot wrong, but we already get a lot right with some animals. And I think there are ways in which we can learn from what farmers are doing right, what technicians are doing right, what lay people are doing right, and build on those good practices.
Mhm. Yes, exactly. Um, yes, there might be some animals that perhaps we might not be able to understand the language.
Hmm.
But also, is it needed to understand all of them?
I don't
Um,
think it is. No, I mean,
um, as
I
long
don't,
as one
yeah,
understands, I'm thinking just now that as long as one understands the language of some animals within, um, yeah, as long as we understand some animals, then I'm not saying that we can generalize, but at least some species we will understand the language, and that knowledge can be used in different ways.
yeah, I think so. I think I'd agree with you there that well, I wouldn't want to suggest that animals, need to have or need to be said to have a language in order to understand them or to treat them respectfully or to give them moral consideration. And certainly, even if we want to say there are certain animals that don't have their own species specific language or don't have language or more rudimentary animals, if we did want to say that, then it doesn't mean that we can't understand them. So, language isn't the be all and end all, but I think there are at least many species other than human beings that do have their own species-specific languages, and those languages enable them to communicate fine with other species and also to communicate to a certain extent with us as well, with humans too. And that there are, where animals have these species-specific language, then there are considerable overlaps with not just humans, but other animals, or there can be considerable overlaps.
Hmm.
There are many free-living animals who will have, I think, their own species-specific language, that a language which overlaps considerably with other species, but not
Hmm.
with Homo
Exactly.
sapiens.
Mm.
But animals communicate meaningfully between each other and do just fine
Mm.
without humans. Um, but there, for us, in living in the world that we do live in, from I suppose a Wittgensteinian point of view, there are forms of shared language that we do most clearly share with other animals, including farm animals, uh, and expect animals used in laboratories and
Hmm.
companion animals, what we
Yeah.
generally understood better as companion animals, but which in certain contexts aren't allowed to express their language abilities to their full
Mm.
extent because there isn't that trusting relationship.
Mm. Yes, exactly. So, that's so there is actually now a question coming from the audience. So I'm gonna read it out loud for you. So this is Joanne, and she is apologizing because she was a bit late, so she doesn't know if this has been discussed already. So
Okay, yeah,
so
I do see it,
can
yes.
you, yeah, I'm just gonna read it. Can you talk a little about how our human understanding of what language is may limit our ability to see non-human animals' language? For
Yeah.
example, we may be more likely to think that a behavior is language if there are talk if they are talking to us,
Yeah.
if there are two talking. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. Yeah, I said somewhere in the talk that, and I didn't talk much about it, but there is a philosopher who talked, well, she's an ethologist first and foremost, but she does philosophy as well. Her name's Martha Kiley Worthington. Martha spelled Marthe.
Mhm.
And she does a lot of work with horses in particular, and she has a farm animals and farms in particular sustainable way and so on and so forth and particular relationships with their animals. But I think that one of the things that she says is that, you know, when humans represent, when humans use language, they're representing the world in a particular way, in a linguistic way. And we have a particular way of viewing the world through that lens of linguistical skills in many ways. But that way of representing the world is just one way of representing the world. And that can, um, Marta says, can actually restrict our understanding. So rather than language being this great, wonderful thing, human language being this thing that can give us the vehicle to understanding, it can tell us everything about the lives of other animals and what
Mhm.
animals are capable of. It can actually be an obstacle to coming to understand the life worlds of other animals. And to a certain extent, it can be this obstacle can be compounded by this idea that linguistic, for those that use a particular type of linguistic language, the human language, then these are the most cognitively able beings as well. So not only do they have this paradigm language, but they also, this is supposed to reveal that they've got these exceptional cognitive abilities.
Mhm.
But we're always behind this veil of our own language, right? So what Joanne
Mhm.
says, I think, is quite important. And philosophers have discussed this for some time, that what is the world like for a bat who uses echolocation? Nagel, Thomas Nagel, who wrote the article, "What's It Like to Be a Bat?" I think it was published in 1978. I can't remember the exact date, but he thought that we couldn't actually come to know exactly what it was like to be a bat because we're always bound by our own conceptual understanding of the world. And I
Hmm.
think I don't think that it's entirely correct that we can never understand the life worlds of another creature. We obviously can't put ourselves in their own minds, so to
Hmm.
speak. But there are some relationships that we have with other animals that are just as close, I think, just as meaningful as relationships that we have from with other humans. Now, I know that's controversial, but for people that who may not have extended family, may not have close friendships, or do feel isolated, then sometimes their companion animals are the most meaningful relationship that they have in the world. And when the animal is of the kind that is able to share our life worlds, then I don't see that I don't see a problem with that. I see why that's a very reasonable thing to say that, I know this animal more than I know this particular person.
Mm.
And that's because we share a particular world with that companion animal to such an extent that, just a very small expression or just thinking about something that causes an expression that we're not aware of can cause a response in another animal. Because there are
Mm.
ways of understanding the world that are much um, are different from our own way of understanding the world, but ways that we can never use because we are human beings. And uh, amazingly, it with companion animals, the relationship still works despite these physical and mental differences.
Hmm. Great. That, yeah, super interesting. Then now we have another question from someone else. This is Catherine. And so she's saying, thank you very much for this truly fascinating talk. Um, she's asking, do you think that AI could help us better decipher and understand animal communication? Oops, that moved. Um, and how it works in the future. Sorry, I'm gonna read it again. So,
No.
do you think that AI could help us better decipher and understand animal communication and how it works in the future? And how would this understanding improve the way we treat animals?
Oh, this is a
And Joanna is thanking you for the answer.
yeah, this is a good question. Maybe someone here in the audience could answer this better than me, but I know there are quite a lot of not quite a lot, but there are more studies coming forth and institutes coming forth thinking about using AI to decipher or encode other animals' languages. And I don't know much about the linguistic coding, but there are AI tools which enable us to sort of translate particular linguistic codes. There might be someone here who's special. We need a specialist in linguistics to help us
Mm.
understand this, the decoding of languages. I do think that AI has its limits because I think AI is only the AI that we're using is only as good as what it's being trained on. So if we're talking generative AI, then whatever tool we're using, v- it's going to be trained on the literature that's available on the internet, whatever's out there. Much of that stuff, I think, will be anthropocentric and will have a particular view of languages. So I think that's important to bear in mind the biases regarding AI. But I think it could offer important insights.
Yeah,
And
perhaps if it's fed with knowledge on specifically how animals interact.
yeah,
Um, mm,
yeah, and of course, it's a wonderful tool to for get doing literature reviews on. on the
Mm.
topic of interactions between different animals, yes.
Mhm.
But I'd be interested to know how the various studies that are now going on with regards to, say, the communications of dolphins and the encoding of linguistic tools used by not the linguistic tools, but the encoding of the linguistic codes of, for example, dolphins and other similar animals. I'd be interested to know how those research groups come along in their findings.
Mm.
But certainly, I think it's something to look towards in the future. I think thinking about how AI can help us in relation to animal ethics more generally too.
Mm. Yes. This is gonna sound a bit silly, but the question on generative AI made me think of, I don't know if you watched the movie, but a movie from Pixar when Up.
I don't think no. Oh yes, I
Oh,
have. Yes, I have.
yeah, with
Sorry.
the
What
speaking
movie?
dogs.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
That was a really good question.
yeah. I've watched that. Yeah.
Um,
But AI will become the norm, won't it,
mm,
for many things, and
mm,
we're already using AI now, aren't we, really, when we're
mm,
using Zoom and so on and so forth, somewhere
yes.
along the line.
Mm. Wow, this has been really interesting. Um, I don't see any more questions coming from the audience. Like, gonna give a few more minutes if anyone has one that they would like to ask you. Otherwise, I understand that you're happy to be contacted about the talk in the future.
Yeah, of
Yes.
course.
Yes.
Shall I put my email in the chat?
Yes.
If you that don't have it, it would be on the slides, but
Hmm.
just for ease of access. If you have any questions, then feel free to contact me.
Great. Yeah. There's already a thumbs up. Yeah, I think it was really interesting what you were talking about. And also, I also think that it can be overwhelming for people that are not used to this kind of discussion. So I think giving them a little bit more time to process the information can help them to reach out to you and ask the question that they would like to, or comment, or
Yeah.
yes.
And that critique as well. I'm quite happy for people not to like the talk or to think it's stupid. Um, yeah, I'd be interested to know also what people think of, animal training more generally, and the presumptions or assumptions that are made in relation to that. Um, Vicky Hearn's quite a controversial figure in many ways, though the animals that she would live with clearly lead flourishing, active, wonderful, I think, lives as companion animals. So it would be that would be quite an interesting
Mm.
thing to hear people's views about it. I
Mhm.
hope you found it interesting anyway, her work, whether or not you agree with her view of language. Yeah. Or
Yeah,
where you might
exactly.
just Chomsky's view of language, universal grammar is the main one, of course, and so it challenges that considerably.
Hmm. Well, on one side, I found it really interesting, and I agree with the claims that she was making. I think we should, and I think that's happening already. That we are opening up a little bit more the how we understand animals,
Mm.
um, and sort of extending. So before we used to say that language is only when you can use words and there is a sentence, for instance, or
Mm.
well, now I can come up with other examples. um, yeah,
And of
but
course, I think also in the history of ideas, animals in philosophy have been excluded from moral consideration on the basis that they lacked this or that particular characteristic. They lacked moral agency, supposedly. They lacked language, supposedly. They weren't capable of feeling pain and pleasure, supposedly. And these are all the reasons that have been given to use animals in particular ways or to
Mhm.
justify using animals in particular ways. And the, the, the the idea that, animals can't use language is still one of those attempted justifications. Or animals can't use language, animals can't tell us what they're thinking or feeling. And I suppose in many ways I see that as the last thing to tackle because we know that an, animals are rational in their own way, that they have agency in their own way, that many are sentient. And I think many also have their own particular species specific language. And that would be the last sort of language isn't unique. Human language is unique, but that's sort of tautological in a way. But our own language does overlap with other species. And so if animals do have language, or some animals have language, then that's another, I think, sufficient condition for treating them in more respectful ways.
Mm. Yes, exactly. I agree. So there's someone here saying that she really appreciates, so this is Kim, appreciate your comment about how our observations of communication being compromised by the environments we have animals in. And Angie is saying that she really loved your speech and thank you very much.
Oh yeah, I'll just before we finish, because she said she loves rabbits, share with you a super cute photo of my rescued rabbits. Uh, and I just couldn't resist, and some lovely pets. And there's another super cute photo of one of the rabbits as well, very relaxed,
Good.
free ranging in the garden. But yeah, that one is super cute. So hope you enjoy that final pic.
That's so cute, yes. Okay, well, sadly, those are really cute animals. Really
Oh,
cute.
well, Angie says she has four rescued rabbits. Yeah, I have three at the moment, so we'll have to talk offline and share some pics, maybe.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, sadly, I think we're coming close to the end. So I think just to say that, like remind people that you're happy to get your questions and comments about the topic and that you have pasted your email in the group chat. So remember to copy that before we close the session. Um, so we would like to thank you for once again for the very interesting and fascinating presentation and bringing this topic to us today. So, and we would also obviously like to thank the audience for attending this webinar and participating, and as well as the ISAE who is sponsoring this webinar series. So, and also before we go, I'd like to advertise our next webinar. This will be on the 4th of May at the same time as today. And this will be a talk by Kat Verheim.
Yep.
Verheim?
Yep. Yep.
Yeah. And she will be giving a talk titled Animals, Humans, and Interspecies Kinship, Learning from Indigenous Conception of Agency in Relationship. And this talk is organized together with the LIFT interdisciplinary seminar series. So I hope you all can attend to this talk as well. And also, as my colleague has put in the chat, we have a free spot awaiting for your fascinating talk on animal welfare and behavior or any related topic. And this spot is on the 1st of June at the same time as today. So if you have an idea or any other project or results that you can't just wait to share them with someone, this is a great opportunity for you. So hit the link that is in the chat, and send us your application for to present at this seminar. So lastly, we just want to remind you to not forget to follow us in the Slack or our Facebook page. So yeah, so with that, I just would like you to thank you again, once again, and that you have the nicest of the rest of the day. Yeah,
Oh,
so
well, thank you, Christian, and thank you, Laura, and thank you, everyone, for coming. So.
that's great. Yeah.